current state of affairs on the African continent, I would say that right now it's a mixed bag. And you can look at Africa and see the glass as half empty, or you can look at it and see the glass as half full. This is a continent on which there is a lot of contagion effect, a dominoes effect. Every time that events happen in one country, because the borders are so porous, because Africans relate across national boundaries, there are always repercussions in other countries, for better or for worse. And you can just look at what happened in the early 60s, when Ghana had its independence in 1957, and then Guinea followed in 1958. Then all of a sudden, all of the other colonies wanted their independence as well. And in the early 60s, we had that period where every African country was rising up and demanding its independence. And that was a very euphoric moment, because there was a lot of hope that all of these former colonies would become full functioning democratic countries. Unfortunately, by the mid-60s, we also saw the phenomenon of one-party states, where countries that had inherited multi-party systems, even at independence, began to shrink political space. We also saw the emergence of military rule and military coups. They started in Togo, and then the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then it became almost fashionable for the military to intervene in the political process. And that went along right into the 90s, into the late 80s, at a time when we began to see what is now being described as the third wave of democratization, when many African countries began to take the course of democratic governance, create more political space that would allow for their citizens to be part of the governing process. Many of you will remember, obviously, being where you are located geographically, some of the events, global events, that have changed the course of politics around the world that have also impacted the African continent. You may remember the end of communism in the former Soviet Union, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and how that had an impact across the world, and especially in Africa. On the continent specifically, there was the independence of Namibia in 1989, which began to shift the power relations in South Africa and helped contribute to the end of apartheid in South Africa, that culminated with the release of Nelson Mandela from jail and his election as the first president of a free and democratic South Africa in 1994. And so the early 90s saw this euphoria about democracy coming to being on the continent. Many countries held national conferences to try to redefine, rewrite their constitutions and put in place mechanisms that would allow greater input by citizens in the governance process of this country. In fact, I was already working with the National Democratic Institute at the time, and we had an in-house joke. We used to joke about how everybody was so optimistic, everybody was so hopeful. It looked like democracy was here to stay, and there were good elections happening, there were militaries that were giving power to civilians, and we all said, well, you know, in the next 2 or 3 years, democracy will take root everywhere. Every country will be democratic, we will be out of jobs, but then we can go off and do something else. Unfortunately, close to 20 years after that, the process has become more complicated. Some people are less hopeful than they were about democratization. There are more questions now than was the case in the early 90s, and we're beginning to see a pendulum swing backwards, a backlash against democratic governance in some countries, and a rollback of some of the gains that Africa had made in the early 90s. In terms of concrete gains, today when you look at the African continent, there are a number of things which we cannot take for granted, despite all of the challenges that we face, and I'll come to the challenges later. But in 1990, for example, Freedom House, which is an organization that rates democratic practices and freedoms around the world, considered that there were only 4 African countries that could be considered partly fair, or partly free. And these countries were Senegal, the Gambia, Botswana, and Mauritius. The rest of the African continent, the rest of the 49 countries on the continent, were either one-party states or ruled by the military. That was the situation then. Today, when you look at Africa, despite all of its challenges, all of the countries on the continent, except for Libya, have accepted a multi-party form of government that allows political parties to form and to compete in the political process. That surely is progress.